Panel 3. Emerging Technologies, Haptics and Screen-Based Approaches. Image, a black and white drawing of a finger tapping a touch screen and a person wearing opaque eyeshades and headphones. Text, Emerging Technologies. Panel Moderator: Joshua Mealy. Panelists: Darren Dufresne, Sheila O'Madrain, Aaron Rodriguez, Matthew Schifrin, Ed Summers.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back from lunch. For those of you joining just now, thank you for coming. So we are kicking off our afternoon session, and in case you are just joining us today, just wanted to go over some access reminders. So we have a few access notes. You can turn on captions by clicking the CC button, but for more personalizable captions, you can also visit tinyurl.com/Longmore captions. For better access, we have turned off the chat today. However, we encourage you to use the Q&A box as if it's a chat room. So in the Q&A box, you can pose questions for our panelists. You can also share resources and reactions and connect with other attendees. Additionally, we have a Facebook group started to allow for additional conversations that can continue after today's symposium is over. If you'd like to check the reminder link we sent, you can find the link to join that group now. Our handy student assistant Nathan has also posted the links in the chat window to the Facebook group and to the attendee directory. And then finally, we have a hashtag for this conversation for anybody who is live tweeting or communicating on social media. That hashtag is #ComicsA11Y. And now we have our next session. We have some panelists and moderator. And because this is a larger session, larger panel, panelists, I'm going to ask that you keep your videos off, or if you like, I can turn them off for you. And Dr. Joshua Mealy, since you are moderating the panel, I invite you to keep your video on for the remaining panel. You guys, this is the Emerging Technologies on Haptics and Screen-Based Approaches to Accessible Comics. My name is Ting Su, and for those who would like a description, I am an Asian American female. I have short chin-length hair, and as I mentioned this morning, I tend to smile a lot, especially when I get nervous, which is when I'm speaking publicly. I am really honored and have the pleasure of introducing this panel. As a teacher of blind and low vision students, I have seen how it is a privilege for typically sighted individuals to say no to technology, but technology can play such a key role for our blind and low vision students and adults in ensuring equity and leadership opportunities in the classroom, in the workplace, and just in the community. So far in the symposium, we've talked about audio approaches, tactile approaches, and I'm sure some of you are really looking forward to look at what are the multimodal opportunities for engagement with information. So with that, I would like to introduce this panel's moderator, Dr. Joshua Mealy. Josh Mealy is a friend, colleague, also known as a mad scientist and technology innovator. For those of you who were on this morning, Josh is also the inventor of UDescribe. So Josh, take it away.
Hey, Ting, Dr. Sue, thank you so much. I didn't have a chance to do a mic check or a video check, so how am I looking? Everything okay with my video, Ting?
Yep, everything else good.
Cool. All right, so this is going to be super cool, and what we're going to try to do today is have more of a conversation about sort of possibilities for advanced technologies and comics access. Obviously, comics are just one of many media that may benefit from some of the technologies that are emerging, some of the technologies that our panelists are playing with and evaluating and prototyping. And I think it should be remembered that technology is not just something that you build out of hardware or software, but technology, I consider the alphabet to be a technology. So systems and sort of frameworks and ways of thinking about things and ways of organizing and displaying information, I think, are also within the realm of sort of advanced or at least unconsidered technologies. So we have a great panel. We are, I'm going to ask each of our awesome panelists to introduce themselves, try to be brief, and in the introduction, in introducing yourself, maybe just say real quick what the technology is that you, or maybe one or more technologies that you're hoping to bring into the conversation today. I'm going to start with, we have a team who has developed a thing called Visling. It's an app, and so Aaron Rodriguez and Darren Dufresne. I'm going to ask Aaron to go first. Aaron is a doctoral student at, well, you can introduce yourself. Aaron, why don't you start us off and maybe just give it a minute, and then we'll switch over to Darren.
Sounds good.
Thank you. Okay, there you are.
Thank you so much, Josh. So quick visual description. I am a bald white man, 30 years old in a very messy office. So the technology that Darren and I are talking about today is Visling, which seeks to make comics accessible by translating text and image, which we feel like is the building block of comics, into sound and touch. And we do this by using a tablet, basically. We're using iPads and Android-based systems. So that's really where, if we're talking about technology, it can be systems. We're looking at translation as a technology.
Great. And is there an automated component to that, or is that a hand is the translation done by humans?
The translation is entirely done by humans at this point, but we hope in the future that some of it can use AI to do some of that translating.
Cool. I suspect that will be part of our conversation today. So thanks and welcome, Aaron. I love that Aaron and Darren, it's like, you know, talk about comics, it's a little bit superhero-ish. So Darren Dufresne, associate professor, please introduce yourself.
I'm not sure if I'm the Robin or the Batman in this scenario. I'm Darren Dufresne. I am a white male, somewhat older than Aaron, with yellow glasses in a likewise messy office in Wichita, Kansas, where I am the director of the writing program and professor of English. And I'll just add, yeah, our app relies on, actually it combines several things. It combines visual linguistics with the haptics that Aaron mentioned, and coding, so that we'll also hopefully have all of these materials fully searchable by the time that we're done with it.
Fascinating. Yeah, I'm interested in hearing more about the catalog and the way you're doing that. But for now, let's move on to Sheila O'Moran, if I'm pronouncing your name right. And Sheila is the lead on a number of cool projects, including what has been sort of colloquially dubbed the Holy Braille, a tool for tactile graphics and Braille representation. Sheila, you want to tell us about yourself?
Sure. Yes. I I don't know in terms of age how I compare with these other people. Oh, I need to start with it. Sorry. There we go.
You all right?
Yes. So I have curly hair that's sort of blondish. I'm sitting in a dining room in Ireland in the sort of late-ish evening, but yes, here for a couple of weeks. So the project I've been working on is, as Josh says, the Holy Braille. And what we're trying to do is to use pneumatic techniques, so air or fluid, to move dots up and down so that we can basically pack lots and lots of dots together to make a full page tactile array. And I'm visually impaired myself, so working on this project has been a real privilege for the, 6 or 7 years we've been doing it now. So yes, that's what we've been up to.
Thank you, Sheila. And I'll just mention that the idea of that sort of dot array is to be able to display sort of a tactile graphics and Braille in such a way that sort of like a dot matrix, a highly pixelated image for sighted people's reference, right?
Yes.
You want to add anything to that? Okay. Um, and okay, great. And you're also, you want to say you're a professor of something somewhere, right?
Oh, yeah. I hold a joint position in the School of Music, where I teach in the Performing Arts Technology program, and in the School of Information, where I tend to do some more sort of HCI work, although my music role is really HCI for digital musical instruments. So it's not as weird as it sounds.
Cool. Super psyched to have you on this panel. Matthew Schifrin, you have developed an accessible Lego instructions system for blind people to use. You want to tell us about that and introduce yourself? You may be muted.
So
oh, there you are. Okay.
I'm now unmuted. So I'm a blind guy in his early 20s, and I've created a system of text-based building instructions that lets blind people build Lego sets on their own. And if you guys would like to check that out, you can visit legofortheblind.com. But the project that I'll be discussing today is Project Daredevil, which is a motion simulating helmet that uses gyroscopes to affect your vestibular system. And the vestibular system is what controls your sense of balance. And as a result, wearers of this helmet will be able to experience different motions like falling or flying, things that superheroes experience in comic books.
That's super awesome. So a virtual reality mode that actually goes beyond hearing and touch and even sort of haptics. So that's very cool. And I'm looking forward to hearing more about that. And finally, last but definitely not least, we have Mr. Ed Summers from, he's the Director of Accessibility at SAS, a big data, big company. And you are the co-author of Reach for the Stars, an accessible ebook on astronomy. Ed, you want to introduce yourself and talk about what comic technology you've been thinking about?
Yeah. Hey there, Josh. Can you hear me?
Hey, Ed. Yeah, I can.
Okay, Ting. I'm not sure, Ting, if we're supposed to have our videos on or off. I think I turned mine on.
Yeah,
I don't know. Who
perfect.
cares? Yeah.
That's right. Hey, before I introduce myself, I do want to say thank you to you, Josh, Ting, Amazon, and San Francisco State for the leadership in this area and sponsoring this event. Thanks.
Yeah, man.
Yeah, Ed Summers. I'm blind as well. I'm middle-aged white male, and I'm sitting in a very bland-looking home office right now that is kind of in the process of being remodeled. So there's not much behind me except for blank walls. I'm Director of Accessibility at SAS, the market leader in analytics, big data analytics company. And what we focus on from an accessibility perspective is making data and data visualization, in particular, accessible to everyone, of course, and particularly people with visual impairments, because that data visualization part is a particularly difficult problem and a huge barrier. So, yep, Reach for the Stars was, I think, probably one of the first born accessible textbooks of any type, but this one was particularly for astronomy. It was supported multimodal, all kinds of multimodal features. And more recently, we published a free tool called SAS Graphics Accelerator, which enables people of all abilities to view data visualizations using a wide set of modalities, which include sonification.
Awesome. And sonification, I think, is an interesting potential tool for representing or for comics access. It'd be interesting to talk about that. There's a couple of terms that I want to make sure we define before we go on too much. I think we'll be using a couple of different terms that I want to make sure everybody's familiar with. So and so that I'm not the one doing the talking. Matthew, I wonder if you could just tell us what haptics is and what how that compares to. Well, tell us what haptics is, first of all.
Haptics is a process by which people can receive information, for example, your phone vibrating. That's haptic feedback. It's feedback that you can touch or feel. And in some cases, it's done using motors, like in your phone. Or one might argue that reading Braille is a haptic process because the pins are moving under your fingers as your fingers move across them.
Awesome, thank you. And sort of the, I think haptics, there are things like haptic joysticks that have force feedback and, things like that. So I think haptics is just a fairly common at this point technology, but I think it's one of the things that'll come up a couple times probably. Sheila, I wonder if you can tell us what the difference is between haptics and tactiles.
So yes, so typically when we think of tactiles, we think of using our fingers to feel small features on a surface, whereas haptics is a bit more general. It has to do with basically the kind of forces that we might interact with as we, for instance, pick up a cup. We might just move it a little bit to see if it has any liquid in it, or if you pick up something and you're trying to balance it. Those kind of, I suppose, more hidden forces are also more aligned with what we would think of as more general haptics. So we then can think about different kinds of displays, such as like tactile displays, which are like the braille displays that people use, whereas haptic displays are more of the kind that we're thinking about with the helmet display, where you're communicating with another part of the system that feels the world, but not in just through the fingertips.
Thanks so much. And then Ed, since you mentioned sonification, why don't you give us a quick overview of what is sonification anyway?
Yeah, so I consider sonification to be the art and science of representing data using sound, and I think I consider it to be kind of a subclass in this broader category of auditory display.
Great. Okay, so for those of you who are saying enough of that, let's get to the comics. So I think that my point really is that all of these technologies, we're looking for ways that that comics and visual information can be communicated to a blind audience. And really, I think that we can all recognize that there's a combination of these kinds of technologies that are going to be used for stimulating or interacting with non-visual sensory modalities. So that's why all of these things are really critical, but it doesn't have to be terribly fancy. I mean, I grew up as a blind kid. My friends and family would read me comics, and they would do it in a very descriptive fashion. We had a great panel earlier today on description and how description works. But that's when you're sitting at the breakfast table with somebody reading you the funnies, that's not exactly on demand. That's not exactly independent. And so I think by bringing in technology, a big hope is to foster that independence and sort of ability of somebody to make the choices that they want around the way this information gets delivered. So I'm going to return to Darren and Aaron and ask you guys maybe to tag team a little bit on talking about the way how does somebody use your Visling app to read a comic? Like, describe the experience for us.
So I actually have I made a video of the prototype. So Josh, would it be okay if we showed that right now?
Did you give it to Ting?
I did. Yeah, it's
all
56
right, then,
seconds long, and I have a brief description of the video for everybody, and I'll read that description right now. What's it? Okay, I don't think that's me. So
why don't you go ahead and read the description, and then Ting can roll the video.
Sounds good. So this video is 56 seconds long. It's filmed from the point of view of the user in 3 different scenes. The video depicts the 3 reading modes in the Visling app. Each scene begins with a white rectangle with the words Visling in black, capital letters, and the name of the reading mode in a white rectangle at the bottom of the screen. In each scene, a Samsung S6 Lite tablet rests in the left hand of the user, who is resting her arm on the table. She is using her right index finger to navigate the program. The first scene depicts the global narrative mode. This mode outputs audio of the general page level narrative. This mode is triggered by continuously touching the play button in the bottom left corner of the screen. The second scene depicts the narrative grammar mode. This mode outputs audio of panel-specific events. This mode is triggered by dragging your finger across the page. When the reader is dragging their finger in the correct order, a single vibration will pulse when the user's finger goes over a gutter. If the reader is dragging their finger in the incorrect order, a double vibration will pulse. The third and final scene depicts the free exploration mode. This mode outputs audio of specific objects at specific coordinates. This mode is triggered by touching individual coordinates on the screen and not dragging the finger. When the user touches an object on the screen, the app will announce what the object is. You can play the video.
The description is longer than the video.
Thank you, Ting.
Global narrative mode, mise en page.
Page 1. Beneath the glowing word Visling, we meet Aaron.
Narrative grammar mode, panel to panel.
Panel 1. In the upper left corner panel, two comic figures are addressing the reader on Panel 2, upper right. Aaron is addressing the reader while holding his tablet in Panel 4, middle right. A warning sign that Panel 2, upper right. Aaron is addressing Panel 4, middle right. Panel 3, middle left. We see the panel neatly divided into 4 sections with Panel 4, middle right.
Free exploration mode, object coordinates.
Darren in a circle. Cupboard door. Speech bubble. Cupboard drawer.
So, okay, great. Thank you. Thanks, Ting. Thanks, Aaron. Maybe real quick, tell us about how you expect, like, how do you expect people to use it? Like, you showed us the mechanics. From a user's perspective, from a person who wants to read a comic, what would you expect them to how would you expect them to proceed?
So I think Darren and I were both teachers, and we've both had students in our class who were blind or visually impaired. And we recognize that the needs of the reader are different in every purpose. And so we wanted to create a product that was sensitive to those needs. So based on various situations, if you're reading the comic for pleasure, you might not care about all the small details. However, if you're studying in the classroom and you have a page that you are analyzing with everyone in class, this translation allows you to touch certain coordinates and understand how the page layout, how the page is laid out.
Thanks so much. Darren, do you want to add anything to this?
Yeah, we also were concerned about the spectrum that people's vision lie on, anywhere from no vision, obviously, to full vision. And so someone of my age has a lot of trouble reading smaller text. And so in that free exploration mode, that allows you to just touch that and get a little bit of feedback. Or if you're trying to navigate, like Aaron described, the mise en page, then that allows you to kind of explore that on the page and get a sense of what the layout of the page is intended to be.
Great. So I guess I wanted to use this as an example of sort of a technology that's being, that you guys are currently developing to provide access to comics for blind people. By the way, I actually don't know the answer to this. Do either or both of you self-identify as blind or visually impaired?
We do not, no.
Okay, cool. Just curious. So I want to just throw this out to the group, and I think I'm gonna maybe I'll ask Ed to lead it off and in the answers. But I'd like each of you to sort of sort of fill in the gaps that are left by the ones before you, and hopefully we'll get a big picture. But what does accessibility mean in the context of comics? I mean, in other words, what are the requirements for a comic to be accessible? Like what are the things we expect? And I just want to sort of build that up so that as we talk a little bit more about the technologies, we can see what questions those technologies are answering. So Ed, just real quick, what do you see as being, what are some of the requirements for a comic to be called accessible for blind people?
Yeah, sure. Well, so I think of accessibility in general as the absence of barriers, and it's the absence of barriers to a great many things. Either the information in the comic, like literally, what's the storyline? Who are the characters? What are the characters' intent? What is the conflict? How does it get resolved? All those kinds of those things that you enjoy about comics. But I would also say that another important part of that are the social dynamics of things, of all things, but including comics, right? So the fact that you can talk about the latest issue with your buds or your friends online or whatever it may be, and kind of have that shared social experience, and plug into that. So I'll leave it at that, and just to keep it short, and flip it over to the next person. They can fill in the details.
Yeah. Hey, Matthew, why don't you weigh in on this? What are the requirements for accessibility of a comic book? Or any comic? What would a fully accessible comic for blind people need to have in order to be called accessible?
For me, a fully accessible comic would need to have not only the kind of essence of the story and the characters, but also an understanding of the environments that they're in. And I've often gotten this information through comic book scripts, but because these scripts are very hard to come by and they change from kind of the initial script to what the author eventually releases, I think that knowing kind of what Visling is doing with describing the various aspects of the images that a sighted person sees, I think it's important not only to understand who does what, but why and how and where they do it as well.
Great. Sheila, what do you think?
I guess, oh gosh. Sorry, I just lost audio there for a little bit.
Do you want me to come back to you?
Yeah, can you just repeat that last?
Yeah, I mean, the question is, what are the requirements for a comic to be accessible? What do we mean when we say
yes, absolutely,
accessible comic?
Well, I think I was thinking about this earlier on too. I think, first of all, the narrative has to be clear. I think somebody brought this up, but also I think you have to have the opportunity to discover the narrative as well. It's like a part of the enjoyment, I think, of a comic is connecting the dots yourself, is sort of seeing how the frames are there and then sort of getting the thrill of getting the joke. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Yeah.
And I think being able to do that unassisted, I think, is a really important part.
And Darren, what's your take on sort of the requirements of an accessible comic?
So as a sighted person, when I open up a comic book, one of the things that strikes me right away is that there's a lot of competition for my attention. And I think for a comic to really be fully accessible, it should allow the user to have access to all those different cultural, visual layout, and narrative elements that are important to a comic, make a comic fundamentally different than an alphabetic text.
Great. And finally, Aaron, any holes you see left by your colleagues?
I think at the bare minimum, accessibility means allowing the reader to ask questions about the text and being able to find the answers to those questions themselves.
Yeah. Okay, so I think we've laid out sort of what the what does accessibility mean in the context of comics? And I think I'm interested in that. I didn't hear anybody mention, I guess Darren sort of touched on it, but I mean, I wonder also, I wanted to add that comics, part of the beauty of comics is the visual aesthetic that each artist brings to the page, and sort of the ability to communicate that aesthetic, I think has to be part of it when it's important. And I think that one of the key requirements would probably be the ability to highlight what's remarkable about a particular comic. Like, you don't really want to be talking about the comic's aesthetic all the time when that artist or that comic is not particularly invested in the aesthetic. But but if they are invested in something else, you want to be able to focus on that. So sort of knowing what the crucial communication elements are is really important. I also one of the other things that I have always really been fascinated by is the visual language of comics, the vocabulary that's used for communicating speed and smell and emotion. There's a great deal that goes into it, and I think that there's a lot to be thought about in terms of how important is it to communicate the raw part of the visual aspects of that language, and how important is it to simply communicate what that language is trying to say. So I'm not going to draw any conclusions about it today, but I will just kind of mention those as things that I want to get into. So I'm going to ask Sheila, I'm going to ask you a question about so some of the folks listening or watching who may or may not be familiar with blindness or tactile representations. Why can't we just turn the comics into sort of touchable images and be done with it?
Wow. Well, it's something I think that anybody coming to creating tactiles for the first time, it's a very valid thing to think. Why can't you just make a tactile version of a picture? And I know that a number of people on the panel, including Josh, have looked at this in great detail. But there's a lot to do with what are things that our tactile system is aware of, and how those differ from the things that our visual system is aware of. And it turns out that the tactile system is less tolerant of things being overlapped or very close together or sort of cluttered. And that one thing, for instance, which makes tactile images legible is leaving plenty of what we call white space or empty space around components of the image, so that those components can be uniquely perceived in their own right. And so that involves thinking about the tactile image in a very different way to the way that you think about the visual image. And that's just one thing. But I also wanted to sort of note that in thinking about communicating things like emotion and other parts of comics, it's easy to think that we have to rely totally on tactiles, but we also have audio. And of course, we all know from our childhoods listening and watching cartoons that there's a very well developed sonic language for communicating things like the speed that something's happening at in a cartoon, for instance. And there's probably a lot of language that we can borrow from those that audio kind of developed, that audio language that was developed for cartoons that might also help us in comics. So it's not just about touch, but it's how can we make these things work together, I think.
Thank you. And I'll just also throw in that, there are things like perspective that make, while a blind person can learn to interpret perspective from a line drawing, a tactile line drawing, it certainly doesn't come naturally.
Absolutely, yeah.
And it's any sort of visual perspective in a tactile representation is just adds huge complexity and is extraordinarily difficult to interpret. So it's really I really like your point about that we're really looking at a combination of technologies. So so with that, Matthew, why don't you tell us about how the helmet that you're working on and the sort of the balance haptics are how do you see those as being used in comics accessibility?
The goal of these haptics is really to convey the nuance of motion when it comes to characters. And some people are going to say, oh, such and such artist, they're such a great artist because they draw figures in motion so well. And our goal is to take those dynamic motions, those leaps, those flips, those swings off of buildings, and to translate them into motions that you or I can safely feel and experience while sitting in a chair.
Super cool. How's that going?
It's going well. We're doing safety testing. It's my friends at the MIT Media Lab and I, and we're just making sure that it's safe to wear. Then it'll be going.
So when you put on this helmet and you sort of execute the swing from building to building script, does it feel like you're swinging from building to building?
Mm-hmm.
And what other kinds of motions can you induce?
We can induce motions like falling, for example, kind of accelerative and decelerative motions, and falls and jumps and kind of rapid switches of directions. If you're driving in a car and there's a car chase and the car suddenly brakes or turns or spins, then those motions can also be induced.
Can you make it feel like you're turning left or right?
Mm-hmm.
That's super cool. I wonder, I feel like that's going to have a lot of other applications as well. I'm really interested in that technology and learning more about it. Have you applied it to comics yet? Have you like written a demo script or anything? And if you have, what have you used as your demo script?
We're working on that now. So we have an audio version of the first issue of Mark Waid's Daredevil comic, and that is the kind of thing that we are adapting motions to. And we're working on that now.
That's really cool. So I'm going to ask another question, and I'm going to ask Aaron and Darren to sort of talk about this a little bit, maybe to start, and then see if other people have comments about it. But as I mentioned at the beginning, I see technology as sort of having a very broad scope. And when comics, were in their infancy in the 30s and 40s, there was another industry in its infancy, and it was radio drama. And I think that radio drama and comics really grew up together. I would call radio drama one of the earliest, or probably the earliest form of accessible comics, because they really were part of the same genre often. And I wonder, what is the difference between sort of and also Chad Allen, who was one of our earlier speakers, spoke, gave some examples of his accessible comic that he's developed, and it strikes me that it's very much like a radio drama. So why can't we just why can't we just call it, say that accessible comics are radio dramas, and that's that we're there already?
I think that removes. I think it's a really good question. I think that removes a little bit of the agency for the reader. One of the things that you do in just reading a straight alphabetic text often is you're recursive in your reading. You'll hit on something and then wait, what set that up? I want to go back to that. And so one of the things that we want to try to mimic is the ability of the reader to move back and forth and to explore different parts of the text. If the text is being read to you like a radio script, you're on a train and you're not controlling that train at all. It doesn't mean that's not a great experience, but it's a different experience than actually engaging the text in this way.
So I think it sounds to me like you're saying those are a form of accessible comics, but we can go further is what I'm getting from that. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that's our hope, is that we can we're not going to like actually make something with what we're working on that is exactly the same reading experience as a fully sighted person is going to have, but we want to offer as much of that experience and the ability to engage with the comic in the way that that's accessible for everyone. I don't know if Aaron wants to add on to that.
Yeah, I was going to say there's a spatiality to reading comics that you can't get in a radio drama which occurs in a temporal setting.
We're touching on some issues around choice and sort of flexibility, and I think, Ed, this is something that's really near and dear to your heart. You want to talk about sort of how this what sort of how choice and the customizability of the experience plays into this?
Yeah, and I think this is following up as well on Sheila's point earlier about multiple modalities. And there's actually an intersection of issues here. As we think about the modality of audition, of hearing, and vision, right? For those, because there's plenty of people who are low vision versus touch and other modalities. Not everybody processes information in the same way, and some people, have, even though they may be blind, they may have multiple disabilities. So for example, a very poor tactile acuity or a loss of use of their hands, or hearing impairments as well. So I think it is crucially important to be able to design technologies that enable kind of the right modality for the individual user to the greatest degree possible. And with that said, to your question, Josh, take music, right? You can listen to a piece of music, or you can look at the score on paper, or a braille representation of the score, for example, and those are really fundamentally different experiences. I mean, in the end, you might be able to get the same information, but the way that you experience the information is, I think, for most people, is very different. And then, the last thing that I think comes up here is I think there's a huge benefit and lots of benefits for people with disabilities if they have the independent access for the whole workflow, the whole ecosystem of the comic, right? And this gets back to your original question, your very first question, Josh, about what is accessibility. And there's the accessibility of the act of reading a comic, the kind of thing you would bring into a usability lab, or a lab for an empirical study. But then there's also that broader context of, well, how do I choose comics, and how do I kind of download them and get them on my device, and how do I browse them, and there's a broader set of activities that go beyond just reading the actual comic. And if we design access technologies that put other third parties between the author of the comic and the consumer of the comic, the reader with a disability. So, for example, Josh, your breakfast table, kind of having somebody read you those comics, that's a third party that's kind of in your way, and it prevents you from just unlimited access to information that satisfies your personal curiosities.
And usually those comics that I was reading at the breakfast table were the comics that the reader wanted to read, right? So not necessarily the ones that I wanted to read. Although, they would, take requests and stuff. But if I wanted to read a whole graphic novel, I was SOL, right?
Right.
So yeah, and you're.
I was going to say, I'm sorry, Josh. Yeah, I was going to say that you also might have to wait until the next day at breakfast in order to get started on that graphic novel because the reader might be busy.
Exactly. Sheila, your thoughts about kind of, you have anything to add to what we've been discussing?
Just a couple of things. One thing to come back to the point about multimodalities, that in the general population, some people are spatial thinkers and other people are not. And that's equally true of the visually impaired population. There are a subgroup of blind people who very much prefer to be thinking in a spatial modality, and others who particularly don't like thinking like that. So, trying to cater to that. But the other thing I was going to bring up is that blind people and people of low vision should be able to author their own comics too. I've often wished, I've had ideas and I've often said, I wish I could get somebody to draw that comic strip, because I think it would work really well. And I don't have a means of doing it. So creating authoring tools that make sense for visually impaired people, but can also communicate their comedic ideas using, form of comics, I think, is equally important. And then finally, the last thing is that we think of comics as satirical things, but I know at least 2 or 3 people now who've published textbooks on things like signal processing and in comic form, and it's frustrating because I can't access those books.
Yeah, and I think, sort of going back to Matthew's, I think the whole idea of graphical information, like we talked, I mentioned his Lego project. I mean, these are sort of instructional. A lot of the time, instructional things come in the form of comics with if you will, narrative and graphics, and they work together to tell you how to do something, whether it's a textbook or an IKEA manual, and the idea of access to the fundamentals of that information are, that's one of the use cases for sort of comics access. It's not just about satire. It's not just about graphic novels. There's the types of genres that are going to be utilizing this format. I think I don't need to tell this audience are only expanding. So talking, Sheila, about your, you mentioned oh shoot, it's gone. You mentioned something that I wanted to bring back.
Spatial thinking, or?
Well, I guess no. It was just I can't remember. Maybe it'll return to us. I want to. I think this is going to be something that sort of intersects with what a bunch of us have been talking about. Ed, I know you and I have done a lot of talking about structured data and how we can, for all sorts of visual purposes, whether it's bar graphs or scatter plots or block whisker diagrams or comics, how can we structure the data that goes into a visualization? How can we create a sort of scalable and deeply sort of expandable mechanism that can be used by something like Visling or Matthew's helmet, or to render simplified tactile graphics of comics, or to say the cupboard door is in the upper left corner of the frame. And possibly even to use this format as an authoring tool, to use it as a representation tool. Ed, you've done a lot of deep thinking about this kind of stuff. What are you imagining in that area, the area of sort of comics XML, if you will?
There you go. Yeah. And I think what you're pointing at, Josh, is a systems thinking approach to accessible comics or anything for that matter. In that, if there are different kind of components of the system, agents of the system, that if we're really going to tackle this thing at scale, we need a way for publishers to publish, representations of comics that can be converted into multiple modalities. And it would be just beautiful if you could we could define a language, let's say a schema, a grammar that can be used to formally describe a comic. And then I could take that and turn it into sonification and haptics using an Xbox controller, which is what we're working on now. Matt could take that and plug that into his helmet. Sheila can drive her tactile display with it. And Darren and Aaron can run their application with it, right? And then what that affords obviously is getting at all these multiple modalities, and different users with different abilities or other disabilities may choose to use any one or more of these devices or modalities because it meets their needs. That's where I think that's one of the ways that we could solve this problem at scale.
And Sheila, I remembered what I wanted to mention. It was about authoring, and it's that I just wanted to sort of give you a +1 thumbs up on the desire to author comics. A number of years ago, I had this sort of semi-autobiographical idea of a tragic superhero comic called Blind Man and Sighted Girl that I never made because it just wasn't. I couldn't think of any ways to author it, but it's absolutely something that we should be thinking about. If comics are a mode of communication and more accepted, how long is it before well, I'm sure how is a blind kid or student going to take a comics class where part of the expectation is to author comics? There are real needs. It's not just sort of my goofy whim, but there probably are now, and will definitely be in the future, needs for blind and visually impaired people to actually author comics.
Could I come back to just something that
I would love it.
Yeah, so
Please.
Thinking of the XML issue and how we might develop a language for building structures that could be rendered in multiple ways. I think we've, if those of us in computer music have been around this block before with synthesized music, where we can have a score that's completely automated. But the one thing that we have to be careful not to lose is that element that Josh was talking about earlier, which is this idea of style or the format of a comic that says this is a Far Side comic versus this, the aesthetic. And so, in computer music, when you just automate a score and have the computer play it, you lose that artist's input. And I'm thinking that if we were thinking about an XML version that would be like, I suppose, MIDI for computer music, we have to find, I think, a way of making sure that gets captured as well.
And I think it's really interesting because from a blind perspective, the aesthetic, it goes back to description. So often things go back to description, but I have a very difficult time imagining how one would convert a visual aesthetic and have it be meaningful for a blind reader other than through description. Because even a tactile or an audio representation doesn't necessarily communicate the visceral aesthetic that you get when you look at the way various comic artists draw and write and do their render their scenes and characters. Matthew, what do you think about this idea of a ComicsXML? Is that something your group is thinking about? And if so, what have you thought in terms of, because a lot of XML, a lot of sort of renderings, Sheila was mentioning the aesthetic, and I think that it's not just what's in the scene, but where are things going? What are they doing? And your technology has a lot to do with motion capture and not the things, but what the things are doing. Any thoughts about a ComicsXML and motion?
I think the ComicsXML could definitely be used theoretically to drive the helmet, to tell, basically, in our current iteration, everything is first person. You are the main character. And because we are combining it with a 3D sound radio drama, theoretically, if you wanted to switch characters or switch perspectives, the soundscape could shift, as could the kind of perspective from which you are viewing events. And if you would like to stand still as a character swings past you, and not feel their motion, but hear what that would sound like, then that is definitely an option. Kind of this more third person standpoint definitely could be achieved through sound and haptics. Going back quickly to what you were saying about authoring your own comics, I think that it's very much, I write musicals. And so like when you write musicals, you have the composer and the lyricist. And often they're two separate people, and it's a very collaborative process, like comic book writer and artist. And if you wanted to make your comic, I think it would just be a matter of finding an artist, writing your own scripts, and it's very much about trust. And I think if you wanted to kind of find an artist and engage with them and kind of make sure that you could trust them enough so that they can give their own artistic spin to it, convey their own aesthetic, but you be responsible for the story and use a comic book script to convey that story to the artist, it could definitely be done.
And I think that that's the approach. Georgina Kleege, who is one of my favorite people, I believe she was in one of the panels earlier. That's the approach I think she took when she, in her writing of comics. And but getting back to Ed's point, and I totally, Matthew, that is in fact how we would do it today. But getting back to Ed's earlier point about choice and independence, is there a way, and I think it's legit for us to consider whether or not technology can afford us independence in the authoring process now, where and a collaboration, obviously collaboration would forever be an option, but what if you don't want to collaborate? What if you're a power hungry control freak and can't stand the idea of giving someone else the artistic license with your ideas? But I hear what you're saying, and I want to just quickly go to Darren and Aaron, the Batman and Robin of comics accessibility, and see if you guys have any thoughts about a ComicsXML. How would your app consume such a technology, what would you have to sort of caution us about something like that, or any thoughts about that at all?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked. Actually, it was the ComicsXML that inspired our project. So I think in 2008, John Walsh, who's a professor at the University of Indiana, developed something called the comic book markup language, which is an offshoot of the text encoding initiative, which has been used for a long time in literary studies, whether that's to mark up a poem in XML or mark up a illuminated manuscript, which is very closely related to comics. What we're trying to do is make that less of a, I guess, mathematical hands-off approach, but more of a sensitive editorial approach to using XML. So kind of like when there is alt text on websites, we want to create alt text for each panel that captures that aesthetic beauty of each panel, that what you're talking about, which is a translator problem. And you can kind of think about it as ekphrasis, poetry written about great works of art. You can capture that same aesthetic feeling that you get in reading a poem that you can in a painting, or so right. People argue. And so we want to combine that with the CBML in order to kind of have the best of both worlds, have our cake and eat it too. So that's our approach at the moment.
Yeah. I'm so glad you brought up ekphrasis. I mean, I consider almost all of descriptively oriented accessibility to be a form of ekphrasis. I really, I so thrilled to hear that. And also my apologies for not being aware of that comic XML history. That's the punishment I get for not knowing everything. Is the comic XML that you referenced, is it in use anywhere? Is it and does it is it something that only goes to the sort of granularity of the panel, or does it go deeper? Does it go into the panel in terms of sort of object-wise just for descriptive purposes?
Yeah, so in short, it can be as descriptive as the editor or team of people working on coding the comic want it to be. So you have an editorial board and you decide the specifics of what you're looking at when you code the comic. To answer your question about is this a working issue? Not really, because there hasn't really been a reason to spend so much time using CBML for comics besides creating a database. It's time intensive, but what we feel like this is the perfect reason to code comics. So then everybody can use this, machine readable and human readable text. So whether that's using it for our app or getting a program to write out specific translations of comics and then making Braille versions of those, that could be used for CBML. So what we'd love to do is get a working group of people all working together to code a bunch of comics as fast as we can.
A comic hackathon.
Exactly. Yeah.
Accessible comic hackathon. Hey Ting, how are we? Do we have a lot of questions? We've got about 15 minutes left for questions. I want to close this section out pretty soon, but I'm just wondering how. Do we have a lot of questions or not too many?
Not too many. There's been a little bit of discussion about the styling like CSS, the XML framework, and exploring that. There was one question from Ruth Tate that I noted down.
Hang on, before we dive into the questions, I just wanted to I just wanted to get a sense of how many questions we had. I'm sorry. So we'll start in on questions in a minute, but Darren, I wanted to ask if you had any sort of closing thoughts about the ComicsXML.
I think Aaron covered most of it, but I do think it's the kind of thing that if we can gear up for that, it's a tremendous amount of work. Obviously, there's 100 plus years of comics that would need to be coded. It could be the kind of thing that could work in a number of different platforms and with a number of different applications.
Yeah. I want to go through and see if folks would like to sort of offer some closing remarks before we go to questions. I'll go. Let's ask Ed first. Any closing thoughts before we go to questions?
Yeah. Well, first off, thanks again to you, Josh, Ting, Amazon, San Francisco State. It's thank you for your leadership and your insights. And I don't have any closing thoughts, but I do want to take the liberty of asking the first question.
Okay, well, I'll come back to you then.
Okay.
Matthew, any closing thoughts?
Kind of going off of what Ed said, thank you so much to everyone for organizing this event and making it happen. And it's just a very interesting time now, I think, in comics and technologically speaking. And there are a lot of mediums that we can employ to make comics more engaging, energizing, and kind of more for us. And I think that it's just a great time to be in the space and creating and making it more accessible for us.
Darren?
Yeah, again, I would just like to say thank you, Josh, to you and to everyone else, and especially to Nick, who reached out to us originally and I think helped us feel a little less alone in what we were working on and helped us find our people. So thanks to everyone involved with this.
Thank you. Aaron?
Yeah, thank you so much again, Josh, everybody who organized this. I think the one ending thought I have is that I think we all have part of the answers in our fields that we spend most of our time in. And I think it's really important for us to come and have these conversations in order for us to learn what we're all doing and what we're all experts in order to use all those powers to find the solution.
Amen. Sheila, any closing remarks?
Sorry. Yeah, I just had one thought, and it's maybe throwing the cat amongst the pigeons at the late stage in the conversation. First of all, to thank you, but then to think, I think we do have a lot to learn from the world of animation. If you think of the way, for instance, keyframe animation is done at the moment, where the keyframes are defined and then the in-betweens are often algorithmically specified. So how does a hand get from A to B? One could imagine that a keyframe could be just something that's not just visual, but haptic or auditory as well. And that the in-betweens, the algorithms that generate the in-betweens might be specific to sound or haptics or vision or whatever, so that could then open up a whole potential space for both authoring and rendering existing materials in multimodal ways.
That's wonderful. You really masked it though with the imagery of the cat among the pigeons. So I had to pull myself away from that. Thank you, Sheila, for that. I think you're right, and I also want to thank. I did very little to organize things. I just sort of came in, but I really want to thank Ting and Emily and Nick for organizing the whole this whole thing and really pulling together a community to discuss this. And I want to thank all of the panelists who have brought such great perspectives and are working on such important technologies to not just help comics accessibility, but to improve access to information by blind and visually impaired people in general and in so many different domains. So you guys all rock. And so let's, Ed, I'll give you the privilege of the first question, and then Ting will go to questions. Ed?
Okay. Josh, this one's for you. My request is that you give us—
I'm not a panelist. Wait a second.
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
My request is that you give us the 30-second elevator pitch for Blind Guy and Sighted Girl.
It was basically a blind guy who thinks that he's all that and wants to, is really very blustery and important about how independent he is, but really he completely depends on Sighted Girl to do all the things that he needs done, and Sighted Girl does them. But it's sort of a Wooster and Jeeves kind of thing, but sort of superimposed on a blind sighted couple. So it's sort of like that. But thanks for asking. And with that, thank you very much, Ed. We'll go to Ting. Ting, you want to throw us some questions?
Sure. Well, I mean, naturally, the follow-up question to Ed's question is, would this be an autobiographical sort of pitch?
I did mention that it was slightly autobiographical.
Slightly or totally?
Come on now.
Anyways, so there were a couple of technical questions that came through on the chat. There was one particular question that was upvoted, so asked by two participants. So I'll just start with that one in case we run out of time. So a couple of our participants asked, what would be the difference between the CBML, comics-based markup language, I'm guessing, and layered EPUB? So for instance, with SMIL, alt text image descriptions.
Yeah, I think Ed is probably best qualified to start us off on answering that.
Yeah, having written Reach for the Stars, or co-authored Reach for the Stars with some wonderful colleagues here at SAS and NASA, that is kind of what we did. Is we created an instance, we created an EPUB, which is kind of like a finished product of a rendering of a book. And what we're looking at with like a markup language is much more kind of foundational and versatile in the sense that it's a fundamental description that can be used to render or generate an infinite number of renderings or presentations of the information. And I'm trying to think of a good analogy. I don't know, Josh or others, if any other computer scientists that are out there. Maybe like for a piece of music, you can have the recording of somebody playing a particular piece of music, but if the score itself, or maybe the music XML, for Sheila, the digital representation of that can be rendered and using by human beings, by different bands, different interpretations. That's really the difference for me.
And I think probably, some of the differences are that, you can use things like SVG and Smile and EPUB, et cetera, to sort of encapsulate and render a whole bunch of different things. But as with so many markup languages, you wind up spinning off sort of specialized sub codecs, or whatever the right word is, because there's baggage in the original parent encoding that you might not really need, that might slow you down in your authoring or interpretation. So I think the idea is not so much that we don't yet have a language that can do it. I think what I'm imagining when I talk about it is a format that's actually optimized for comic accessibility, and that allows you to group things so that you can have objects with lots of child objects and lots of descriptive information associated with every level of those groupings, along with directional information if they're moving and stuff like that. Any other thoughts from the? Well, actually, let's actually move on. Let's take another question. We've spent a lot of time on the XML, and that's my fault.
No, that's right. And actually, Josh, with only 2 minutes left, I wonder if instead of taking another technical question that we might not have enough time for, if you would like to share some closing thoughts before we conclude this panel.
Thanks, Ting. I think what I'd like people to take away from this is that this is one special case of information accessibility that we need to address. We will never run out of accessibility problems to solve. This is one that is really important because of the way our reading habits are changing. We've spent a lot of time trying to get access to text information for blind people, and we're almost there, really. But now we're shifting into a world where video is much more important, and we're still dealing with. We don't have anything like the Chafee Amendment for audio description. Similarly, captions. There's no rule that says I'm allowed to audio describe any material that I want. And so that's a sort of political block to accessibility. And as other forms come along, like as comics become more and more mainstream and important for not just enjoyment, not just entertainment, but education and employment as well, we need to figure out how to make comics accessible. And the longer we wait on this, the longer. This is the problem we had with audio description. People thought, oh, audio description's not that important. It's just for giving people access to TV shows. Well, now everything is a TV show, and without good access to audio description or other ways of making video accessible to blind people, we are leaving them behind in the information we're able to consume, and therefore the opportunities we can have. The same thing is true of comics. We need to jumpstart this process, and the longer we wait, the more people will lose out on opportunities, economic, social, etc. So this is not just an academic question. This is a really important question that impacts people's lives, even though many folks may not quite see it that way yet. And I want to once again thank you, Ting, for organizing this conversation, and Emily and Nick and San Francisco State, and thank you to the Amazon People with Disabilities Affinity Group for sponsoring, and thank you to the panelists, and of course thank you for being part of our thoughtful and engaged audience.
Hey, thank you, Emerging Tech Panel, and Josh for moderating, and all our panelists for supporting this event. I know you left many of us with a lot of thought and hopefully inspirations for what to design and build next. So we are now off to our next 15-minute break. So we invite you to come back at 2:30 p.m. Pacific time for our final panel for the day. Panel 4 will be talking about depictions of blindness in comics. So enjoy your break, everybody. Thank you for coming.